Hello, everybody. Hello, neighbours of Oxford. It's lovely to be on this call. The work I've been doing for the past 7 or 8 years has been taking me thinking globally and all over the world. And this is the first time I've actually had a conversation that brings these ideas to this city in which we all live. I'll just kick off and say something about my connection to Oxford. So I was a student here in the 1990s. I studied PPE, the infamous degree. It's the economics of that I specialised in and got most frustrated about. And I walked away and went and I worked in Zanzibar for some years. I worked at the UN in New York, and then I moved back to Oxford. The reason I'm here is because I came back to work for Oxfam in 2002 and settled down, met somebody, had kids, bought a house, and suddenly this is where I live. And that's my story of kind of coming to Oxford and coming back again. So what I want to do is share some of the ideas of donut economics, the kind of the conceptual frame about why we even need to rethink economics, and then bring it down to the work that I've most recently been doing, which is downscaling the city scale. We've downscaled in Amsterdam, and I know when some people saw it, the work we've done in Amsterdam, people said, "What about Oxford?" So I'll be very honest, actually, we had a lot of requests from a lot of cities, and I've had to delay lots of them because we're setting up an organization, and this is the only one I said I have to show up for my hometown. So this is a special event for me. So I'm going to share my screen and talk about donut economics and whether it's an idea for Oxford. So what I'm going to present is not about Oxford. You are not going to see pictures of Oxford in here. I'm presenting the ideas, and I invite you all to listen to it through what you know of the many versions of Oxford that you know, and to then consider whether this is something that is useful to Oxford or not. If it is, fabulous. If it's not, let's move on, find other ideas. I've never got an agenda of pushing anything. It's where it's pulled and drawn, that's go where the energy is. So, like I said, I came to this city in the early 1990s because I grew up in the 80s. I was a teenager of the 1980s, and I saw a hole open up in the ozone layer. I remember in the mid 80s, as many people of my age and beyond will, a famine in Ethiopia. And to me, these were the motivating global events. And I thought, I want the toolkit that will help me do something about that. And I thought, if I learn economics, then I'll be able to help that. So off I skipped to university, study economics. And I'd never studied it before. So I was just absorbing the theory for the first couple of years, just, catch up, learn it. And moved into studying development economics, which made a lot more sense to me than anything else I was taught. And then I ended up walking away from it and never wanting to call myself an economist, because I found that actually an embarrassing frame when I realized that other social sciences talked about power and gender and privilege, and economics didn't do that. And the planet seemed to be missing. There wasn't even an option to study environmental economics when I was a student. It just didn't exist. It does now. That's the big change they tell me that's been made in PPE. Too slow. So I walked away from economics, and then through my work at Oxfam, through the financial crisis, in the global financial crisis, 2008, everybody started saying, we need to rewrite economics to reflect financial crisis and to reflect financial realities. And I thought, I'll be darned if we only rewrite economics to reflect that, because we're in the middle of an ecological climate crisis and a global crisis of inequalities. And there are so many things that are missing in economics. And I remember sitting at my desk in Oxfam thinking, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, economics is going to start getting rewritten, and I want to put my energy into being part of that. And that's why I then left my job in Oxfam in 2013 and started writing Donut Economics. So I want to share with you some of the ideas that came to me. And one thing is the power of pictures. What I'm going to show is a lot of pictures, because pictures are really powerful. The images we see shape the way we think, and they sit in the back of our heads in our visual cortex, and they shape what we put at the center and what's at the margins, what's visible and what's left invisible. So it really matters, the pictures that we draw and teach. And I invite you to question all pictures. So I'm going to kick off with the pictures that have shaped 20th century economics. So the starting point, I asked students worldwide, what's the first diagram you remember learning in economics? And worldwide, it's the same answer: supply and demand. Welcome to economics, here is the market, which is an extraordinary jump to make. The idea that the economy is the market, this is where we should obviously begin and then add things around it. But also it privileges the idea that price is the metric of concern that we should focus on. And it puts the market relationship at the center of our thinking. And then anything that falls outside the market price is what economists would call an externality. the idea of externalities was actually created 100 years ago this year by a very brilliant man called Arthur Pigou, who totally saw that there was value that wasn't reflected in market prices and it needed to be reflected. So he came up with this concept. I think he'd turn in his grave if he knew that 100 years later we hadn't done anything more than keep using this idea of an externality. So we find ourselves facing the death of the living world. And economists will say, well, yes, obviously that's an environmental externality. And to me, that's an alarm bell. We're going to talk about the death of the living world as an environmental externality. We know that the models we're using do not serve the times that we live in. The next picture I want to share is the self-portrait of who we tell ourselves we are. And the character at the heart of economic theory is rational economic man. And he's never drawn, so I decided to give him a portrait. He would be a man standing alone, no dependence, no obligations to others, no influence from others. He's apparently totally determined his own wants and needs. He's standing there with money in his hand, an ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and nature at his feet. He hates work, he loves luxury, and he knows the price of everything. And the real problem with this character is that the more that students learn about him from year 1 to 2 to 3 of their studies, the more they come to value competition over collaboration and self-interest over altruism. So the models we create of ourselves shape who we become. And that really matters for any academic discipline that actually claims to tell us who we are, because it changes who we become. And then finally, the goal. What's the goal in economics? It's so deep inside the theory that it actually almost never gets discussed, but the shape of it is very familiar. It's this idea of endless growth, and we hear it in politicians' speeches, and it's embedded in economic policy making, that if it generates GDP growth somehow, then success, tick, job done. And yet we have ended up with economies that structurally expect, demand, and depend upon growth continually, even though I think we've just lived through an era where growth was the condition, but it doesn't mean it can go on forever. So we need to challenge that. So for me, these 3 diagrams at the starting point of economics shaped very much the economic mindset of the late 20th century and early 21st. And yet the 21st century has begun in a very different way. 2008, we had that financial meltdown. We are living in an era of climate breakdown. We are now, right now, in this country and many others, in COVID lockdown. And this collapse, the breakdown of systems, tells us many things. 1, we are profoundly interdependent with the rest of the living world. 2, there's no good coming up with a solution to the financial crisis, and then we'll have another solution to climate crisis, and we'll have another solution to global health pandemics. They are interconnected and need to be tackled holistically. And 3, these crises in many ways arise from the very models and economic theories that we've used, with this sort of idea of endless expansion, and those externalities which somehow seem peripheral come back as a great big whacking feedback loop and kick the center of our systems and profoundly threaten human well-being and create existential risk for billions of people, especially in the world's poorest countries. So we need theories of our own. We need theories from this century that reflect current realities. I'm inspired by Buckminster Fuller. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And sometimes the most powerful form of protest is to propose something new. So that's what I wanted to do in my critique of economics. We're just long past the time of mere critique. We've got to be propositional. So I start with the proposition of a donut. Let's start with purpose. Let's start with the goal that in my entire economics education was just left undiscussed. Let's start openly talking about what we value and what we as a generation, all of us at the beginning of the 21st century, would like to know that our children's children at the end of the 21st century will look back and ask, what did they do? How did they shape this century? So I offer this as a compass for human prosperity. And imagine humanity's use of Earth's resources radiating out from the middle of this picture. So the hole in the middle of the donut is a place where people are left falling short on the essentials of life. It's where people don't have the food and water, healthcare, education, housing, political voice, gender equality that every person has a claim to. I can say that because the world's governments have already agreed on this. I drew these 12 social dimensions from the Sustainable Development Goals, which gives them a strong credibility that governments have committed to this. It doesn't make them right. It talks about gender equality, but not racial equality. It doesn't talk about community and culture, because that's how the Sustainable Development Goals were founded. So there's a caveat on what's shown here, but it's very strong in terms of international recognition that these things every person has a claim to. So let's meet the needs of all people. Leave no one falling short in the hole in the middle. Get everyone into that green ring. Now, the 20th century had pretty good grounds for saying, well, you know the way to do that? GDP growth. There was a strong correlation, especially post-World War II. As the economy grows, people get jobs because they were labor-intensive jobs. Families can afford more things. We can build things. And so actually there was a correlation between growth and meeting the needs of people. And then now we know too much, because at the beginning of the 21st century, we realized there's an ecological ceiling, that humanity's expansion actually runs into Earth system processes that we start to kick out of balance. We cause climate breakdown. We create catastrophic biodiversity loss. We deplete the ozone layer, acidify the oceans. And these 9 dimensions around the outside are known as the 9 planetary boundaries created by Earth system scientists just a decade ago. Only 10 years ago did we recognize the life-supporting systems of planet Earth and realize that if we just keep expanding our impact, we literally kick ourselves out of this stability of this delicately balanced planet that is the only known habitable planet in the universe. So the goal of the donut is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And suddenly already the shape of progress has changed. In the 20th century, where it was this ever-rising line of growth, suddenly we've now got this sense of dynamic balance. And that, as the shape changes, we know we're starting to change paradigms, because just what health feels like is totally different. It's much closer to what we feel in our bodies. We know that our bodily health lies in balance. And if we can take the metaphor of bodily health to planetary health, to me, that is the biggest opportunity we have to reframe our understanding of thriving life. It's health in balance. But if that's where we want to get to, well, this is where we are. All of the red shows you the extent to which humanity is falling short. So that red line on food goes 11% of the way towards the middle of the circle, because 11% of people don't have enough food to eat every day. We want to eliminate all the red in the middle. That's the deprivation of people worldwide, in countries rich and poor, people sleeping on Cowley Road, as well as people in cities in Bangladesh represented there. And while there's that deprivation going on, we've already overshot at least 4 of these planetary boundaries: on climate change, on excessive fertilizer use with nitrogen and phosphorus, on biodiversity loss, on land conversion, and we don't know where we are on air pollution and chemical pollution. So scientists think, even though they couldn't quantify it, they say we could actually be over on those as well. So this, to me, is humanity's selfie. This is a picture of ourselves at the early days of the 21st century. And the question is, what do we do once we've seen it? Because last century's economists never saw it. Last century's policymakers never saw it. Last century's business leaders never saw it. This is ours. It's our picture and our reality to absorb, and it hits hard. And the question is, what do we do once we've seen it? Because we can't unsee it. We need new theories, new approaches, new practices and policies of our own that belong to our era, that's defined by this. So where do we go? Well, for me, I restart economics here. If I'm teaching anyone economic thinking, I say, let's start with the big picture. We should start with the whole. And let's recognize that the economy is a subset of society. It is a social construct, which is good news, because it means we created it and we can recreate it. And society is part of the living earth, humanity and the rest of the living world. And we draw in materials and matter and put out waste and pollution. And we're bathed in a river of solar energy. So there's the thermodynamics running through the economy. It's not circular. It's got a one-way line of energy running through it. And we've got to be smart and harness the sun's energy. But look inside the economy itself. We've got the market, yes, there's the old supply and demand, and the state. And those two show up in GDP, in national income. They're the monetized part of the economy. And the 20th century was dominated by the Cold War, which meant that we had this sort of fight between free market capitalism and state-loving socialism, and which side are you on? And it got very dominated by that. I'll say also economists were typically men, and so their world of work operated in this sphere. You go out and you get paid for the work you do. But that boxing match between market and state meant we lost sight of 2 other fundamental forms of provisioning for our wants and needs. The household, where we're all actually locked down right now. I mean, we cannot ignore the household right now, but we all begin our days here, and it's about the caring for our partners and our children. and the unpaid reproductive work of cooking and washing and cleaning and sweeping and raising the kids and socializing humanity. I'm raising 11-year-old twins, and the last decade has been a story of socializing them and teaching them social skills to make them members of society, and that's crucial work. And there's also the commons, which many economists would say, the what? It just isn't even taught. And it was Elinor Ostrom who made the commons famous, because she got a Nobel Prize for recognizing the value of the commons. It's a place where people come together, not through the market and not through the state, but as a community. We could say what we're doing right now is a commons, because we're coming together as a community to co-create a conversation that we value. And so it's never going to be reflected in monetary value, but the value is created by us coming together and cooperating. And of course, the household and the commons this way doesn't show up in GDP, doesn't show up in national accounts, but we know the profound value for well-being of these forms of provisioning. So to me, I want to live in a society that has all four forms. I wouldn't want to miss any one of them. I think they all have valuable traits, but we need a rebalancing. I'd say the 20th century was very dominated by the market over the state, and squeezing the household and squeezing out the commons. And we need a rebalancing to bring them back. When we look inside the economy and we think about who we are, well, mainstream economics has us show up as rational economic man. We show up in economics, where we start with the market, as consumer or producer. You're either shopping or you're working. Shopping or working, or shopping or working. And it puts us in this very narrow, get the best price, negotiate, bargain, self-interest. It puts us in that mode. And a creditor or debtor in the capital markets, or labor or capital, if you want to put it that way. This is a very narrow version of who we are. And when we bring in these other sectors, suddenly, in relation to the state, we may be public servant. And we've been clapping for the NHS and for key workers and recognizing the value of that work. We may be resident of a city or country, voter and protester, all crucial roles. In relation to the household, parent, partner, relative, child, those caring roles that we provide to each other, and we know so much of our well-being depends upon. And in the commons, volunteer, sharer, co-creator, steward. For me, one of the insights that COVID lockdown has given us is to see that literally when the market is physically shut, because we need to physically distance, we get the rise of the public sector. We see the value, and we applaud literally the public workers, and the state steps in where the market can no longer reach, and steps in with furloughing and underpinning people's salaries. We also see the centrality of the household and the caring work that goes on there, not only for the sick, but the homeschooling. And of course, this can become deeply stressful. When Boris Johnson said, well, perhaps we can just take it on the chin, this is an idea that households should just sort of bear it. And yet we know that domestic violence increases in times like this, because the pressures on the household become untenable. So we can't put households under utterly undue stress and think we can take that pressure. And then the rise of the commons, people realizing there's actually purpose, joy in connecting. I live on a street in East Oxford where we'd actually lost community. We didn't have, I knew a few doors, we didn't have community. At the beginning of this lockdown, like streets all over the world, we went round door to door, we created a WhatsApp group. Suddenly I live in a community, and I never want to lose that. And I think that's something that people feel everywhere. The we of society has been made much more visible, often in resistance to the roles that we now have to step into when that market space shut down, and people don't want to lose that after this pandemic. So let's start with the big picture, recognizing that our economies have multiple forms of provisioning for our wants and needs. But how do we get from this space of overshoot and shortfall into the donut? This, to me, the red here shows that we live in a deeply unequal world, because billions of people can't meet their most basic needs, and yet others have the resources to overshoot the planet's boundaries. But it also shows me that we live in a highly degenerative world, where the ways we meet our wants and needs, the industries we have, are running down the living planet on which we depend. So we need to change those two fundamental dynamics. We need to move from a divisive economy to a distributive one, and from a degenerative economy to a regenerative one. And I want to talk about those two dynamics that, for me, as front and center of everything I'm looking for in terms of the new economic patterns. So some economic forces create a centralizing effect. They concentrate value and opportunity in few hands. And what we need actually is distributive structures, whether it's policies or literally physical structures in places that distribute value and opportunity. And just when I think about it in relation to cities, how can cities be distributive by design? Well, often we know it because what we see it when in what George Monbiot calls public luxury. So here's some examples of public luxury. Transport in Curitiba in Brazil, the buses have their dedicated lane. Imagine that. Imagine taking the bus to London in a dedicated lane, or buses in Oxford itself on a dedicated lane. It's fast, it's efficient, it's affordable, it's the most obvious way to get around. Why wouldn't you? In the city of Vienna, did you know that 60% of people in Vienna live in housing that's either owned by the city state or owned by cooperatives? It's affordable, great quality housing. There's no stigma about living in a council house or a state house. That's just the norm because the city chose to retain ownership of the housing. And so it's affordable for people and totally transforms housing affordability. There was somebody I saw, somebody on the screen's got a lovely sign behind him saying, I think Frank, saying unaffordable housing. Well, in Vienna, they have affordable housing because of how it's owned. In Medellin, in Colombia, one of the most dangerous cities, the most dangerous neighborhood, they built a public library and community facilities right there to create new opportunity for that community. And then in Paris, right along the River Seine, where it used to be just car after car after car, it's people settling, picnicking, connecting, commoners meeting. So I love these examples of distributive design, and we can bring this to Oxford and think, where is existing distributive design in Oxford and where could we create it here? What about the degenerative economic system we have? We have a system that's got this linear, take Earth's resources, make them into stuff we want, use it for a while and throw it away. And that's what's pushing us over planetary boundaries. So we need to turn that linear system into a circular system where resources aren't used up, they're used again and again, far more collectively, more carefully, more creatively, more slowly, so that we create a cyclical or circular economy and we regenerate Earth systems. Here are some examples of regenerative by design. Toilets built in the slums of Nairobi. They collect the human waste and turn it into fertilizer and reapply it to the fields. Really clever, smart, low-tech way of closing the loop of nutrient waste and creating massive value throughout the community. Health, income, fertile soil. Urban farming on the rooftops of Paris and everywhere. Solar homes, and circular construction in Amsterdam. So this is a building that's a wood timber building, so the carbon is sequestered in the building materials instead of released by them. And this building is, instead of its glue shut, where things are glued together, and then if you want to dismantle a building, you just bash it down, it's click and bolt, so that everything can be disassembled and the materials could be reused again. So it's, again, at the level of architecture, the design is different, and it creates far more regenerative effects. So distributive and regenerative by design. For me, these are the dynamics I'm looking for in businesses, in cities, in national policies, because I think they're the dynamics we need to put into play that will take us where we want to go. To say the obvious, there's no one way of doing it. There's no single policy or set of policies. It will look different in different places. But a question I want to move to now, can this become a tool for places, the idea of this donut? Ever since I first published it as a discussion paper for Oxfam in 2012, people started saying, well, that's a powerful global image. What does it mean here? Could we scale it down to here? And what would it mean to put these policies into action in places? So let's take the conversation down now. Researchers at Leeds University did a brilliant study. They took the concept of the donut and they took data for 150 countries and they downscaled the donut to 150 countries. So here you want to fill the central circle in blue from the way they've drawn it. So the UK, for example, now remember, this is a global scale. So it's a metric of well-being that applies from Zambia to the UK. So it's a very low bar, which is why the UK looks almost filled in. But it's shocking that even though we're one of the world's richest countries, it's still falling short on employment and equality. And that's not a surprise to us. So the UK is nearly meeting its social foundation, massively overshooting the planetary ceiling, because this is not from the CO2 and nitrogen and phosphorus emitted in the UK. It's from all the resources embedded in the clothes we buy and the electronics we buy and the food we import. So it's our consumption-based footprint from worldwide. So the UK almost meeting needs, massively overshooting. Zambia at the other end, hardly putting pressure on the planet, but massively falling short on people's needs. And then you've got China in the middle with the double whammy of falling short on many people's needs and already in overshoot. Now, if that makes you feel depressed because no end of the spectrum is any country close to it, let me show you one country that might make you feel a bit better, which is Costa Rica. So Costa Rica is nearly meeting people's needs, almost within the means of the planet. And of course, the real question is, which direction is this going? Are they going further away in both directions, or could they turn that around? Interestingly, they've just launched an initiative called Regenerate Costa Rica, and they're using the donut as the concept, saying we want to use this as the metrics for guiding our future. And I think within a decade they're just going to rename themselves Costa Regenerica. It's kind of asking for it, right? It's a great country name waiting to happen. So that's the national level, but come on, let's bring it down another level and make it really specific to a place. And this is the work I've been doing over the last year and a half with C40 cities, which is a network of global cities that are committed to keeping global heating under 1.5 degrees, circular economy, biomimicry 3.8. We've done downscaling in Amsterdam, Portland, and Philadelphia. And the question that we bring to cities, and now I invite you to put your Oxford hat on. Okay, listen to everything I say from here on through the lens of Oxford. What does this look like? So the question we bring to cities is this: how can our city, Oxford, be a home to thriving people in a thriving place, while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? Now that's a 4-part question, and we break it down in the analysis to 4 sub-questions. So the first one, what would it mean for the people of Oxford to thrive? Well, does Oxford have some city goals? In Amsterdam, we went to the goals. The city had this whole set of targets of what they wanted to achieve as a city. We said, well, that's your goals. This is your democratically elected council. That's the best set of stated goals. Or you could create a citizens' assembly to come up with a new set of goals that you believe reflects what the city wants. But what do we think it means to thrive here? What is a good life? And how far away are we from that? So let's match that with available statistics. So that's the people thriving, determined by themselves. The question then is, what would it mean for Oxford to thrive within its natural habitat? Well, what is our natural habitat? Now, if you ask an ecologist, where's the natural habitat? They might say, well, go to Wytham Woods. That's not even ancient forest, but it's kind of good, intact ecosystem of the place. So you could go to Wytham Woods. And if we went with Janine Benyus, the biomimicry thinker on our team, she'd say, right, let's take a hectare of Wytham Woods. Let's measure it out. Now we're going to measure how much carbon dioxide does this hectare of woods sequester? What if our city could sequester the same amount per hectare? How much does the woods here cool the air on a hot summer's day from the top of the trees to the forest floor? By 5 degrees, 3 degrees, 7 degrees? How could our city cool the air so we don't get an urban heat island effect? How much biodiversity is housed here? How much groundwater is stored under the soil after a storm? How could our city mimic the generosity of the wildland next door? So I love this question because it's radically or wildly ambitious in the most literal sense, but utterly natural. Nature is performing like this here. So how can our city aspire to match or exceed the generosity of the wildland next door? I would love to see that study done in this city. There's got cities packed with ecologists who could go out and take the metrics of Wytham Woods and bring it back and say, let's make these the metrics of our city. So the third one, what would it mean for our city to respect the health of the whole planet, not just our local ecosystem, but all the resources that are embedded in the food and electronics and construction materials and clothes and all the consumer goods that we import? And there we look to kind of like an ecological footprint of the city, and we've been doing that downscaled. You won't be surprised that all 3 of these cities, of course, are massively an overshoot, because that's the story of cities in high-income countries. So how can we massively reduce our global consumption footprint and come back within our share of planetary boundaries? And then the last question, which often gets missed out in this kind of work, but we insisted it's here, is the well-being of people worldwide. If we're impacting on the whole planet, what about all people? And how does a city impact on people worldwide? You could measure that in so many ways. You could measure it of who are the students internationally who come to our city and what do they take back with them? What does our city invest in? What companies is it invested in? What impact is that having worldwide? What are the remittances that are earned in this city and sent home to families worldwide? What are the connections, cultural connections with twin cities? So many ways you could do it. The way we did it here was to connect it with the ecological footprint of our city on the planet, and say, if a lot of our footprint comes from construction, electronics, and food and clothing, let's look down the global supply chains of those 4 sectors and look at the labor rights in those supply chains. And there's research, of course, that shows us that there's often exploitative conditions for people working at the end of those supply chains. So they often exploit nature and exploit people because they're under common business practice. So we revealed the labor rights at the end of these global supply chains. And so the portrait looks like this. I know you can't see the words, but I just wanted to show you what it looks like when we put it on the page. And then we took it to the policymakers in these 3 cities. And these are photographs from Portland, Philadelphia, and Amsterdam, working with city officials and community members, sitting at their portrait, really getting to see how their city's doing in these different areas, and starting to have conversations they've never had before that connect them and help them have this holistic view of the city. So somebody might say, well, I work in education, and well, you work in sewage, and they work in racial equality, and this person works in transport, and we've never met before. But this portrait helps us see the deep interconnections and the possible synergy of what we're doing. For me, one example from Amsterdam, so they know that they need to build more houses in Amsterdam. They say, right, we need more housing, more people are coming here, the price of housing is very expensive, but we can't just build more housing as we've always done, because we know we're driving climate change. And you can see there Amsterdam's red overshoot of planetary boundaries on carbon and many other things. So we can't just build more housing because we're running into the ecological ceiling. And that's partly what's motivated Amsterdam to adopt a very strong circular economy principle. They say we're going to be 100% circular by 2050. 100% circular. Nobody even knows what that means yet, which I love it. It's like Kennedy saying we're going to go to the moon, but we don't even have the materials yet. We don't know how we'll get there. It's that kind of moonshot ambition. By the way, Amsterdam has committed to banning all fossil fuel cars in the city by 2030. No fossil fuel cars in the city in less than a decade. So they've got some ambition going. So yes, it will tackle climate change. It'll also tackle air pollution, waste generation, excessive land use. So there are multiple benefits to this. It also helps with the local ecology. If you do circular building in the right way, you can sequester carbon in wood timber buildings. You can harvest energy if you've got solar panels. You can support biodiversity if you build in ways that actually allow nature to come back into the city. There's other health benefits, housing, equality, community, creates jobs and income. So multiple benefits. And then depending on how you create circularity, it'll have complex benefits on people in other parts of the world who are in those global supply chains. Will it improve or worsen their health, their community connection, their jobs, their peace and justice? So how will it impact people worldwide? And that's a much more complex one to unpick. But for me, the real excitement about these city portraits is to say to the cities, look, we've created a public portrait based on publicly available statistics and data and city targets. That's what we could do. But what happens if you turn it into a city selfie? If you then, as the citizens of your city, map onto it the connections, the many, many connections you can see across here, across all of these different lenses, so you start to get a holistic view of the interconnections. You plot onto it the things that are already happening, the initiatives that are already underway. Any good systems thinker will say, before you intervene in a system, check out what's working. Find out what's underway and celebrate that, because of course there's a lot already happening. Get people's values, listen to people. What do they value about the community that they live in? What do they value about the ecological life of their city? How do they see their impact on the rest of the world and on the people worldwide? So reflect people's voices in it. Bring lived experience quotes from the vastly different experiences. Let's get quotes from Summertown and quotes from Barton, so that we recognize, people think of Oxford, right? Oxford, the elite city. And of course, we know that there's vast diversity here between so many different kinds of households. Let's reflect that and acknowledge the difference of experience. Let's bring in flags that say, we could create an initiative here that would have synergistic effects in all these different domains, so that we start to see the interlinkages. And of course, we're looking for policies and openings and initiatives that have multiple linkages all at the same time. Last point I'm going to say. When we've been working with these cities, they've said, we realize that if we're going to make these transformations, we need to transform ourselves. As Amsterdam said to us, we can't do this with the city institutions we currently have. We're working in silos. We never connect. We don't talk. We follow different mandates. And so we ran a workshop for them that we often run with companies, actually, to help them look at the design of themselves. So just an overview of it. And again, this will really bring us to Oxford. 20th century cities very much focused on serving a growth city. So the overriding question of the city is to say, how can we make our city grow? Yeah. That's the aim, right? Growth, and that's what a good city is, growing. But the 21st century policymaker in a city asks a very different question. Our city may be growing, people may be coming, but how do we make our growing city thrive? Very different purpose. And what defines whether we're facing this growth in orientation or thriving orientation? I think it's these 5 design traits: the purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance of a city. And so now let's really think about this through the lens of Oxford. How can we create a city, and how can we have Oxford in service to being a thriving city? So the first question is, what is the purpose? What's the stated purpose of our city? Working with Amsterdam, I know they've got a purpose. They say Amsterdam aims to be a regenerative, inclusive, thriving city for all residents while respecting planetary boundaries. Wow, I wish more cities went for that big purpose. So that's their stated purpose. And the need for resilience, I think, is going to be an inheritance out of this particular COVID moment. But we have to align everything else with purpose. There's no good having a great purpose if we don't align it with, for example, networks. So how does the city relate to its citizens? How does it engage and listen to and really enable citizen engagement? How does it relate to all of its change makers, whether they are small startups, NGOs, community organizers, part of the universities? How do you mobilize your change makers? How does the city procure, right? Its own relationship to supply chains. How is it affecting rights of people worldwide through the ways it procures? So all of these different kind of networks, and your networks, of course, reinforce or undermine your values. So choose your networks wisely. Then governance. What is the scope of governance? So in Oxford, I'm always confused, as I'm sure many of us are, about, is this about Oxford City Council? Is this about Oxfordshire? Where are the levers of power here? And what's county governance, what's national governance, what's international governance, what can we actually change here in the scope of governance? Who has voice? Who has voice in decision making? Who's even at the table when decisions are made? And what are the rules and the practices and the metrics by which success is judged? And how do they connect to the purpose of the city? Purpose, networks, governance. That's the easy bit. Let's get down to the real stuff. Ownership. How is the city owned? Who owns the land? Who owns the housing, therefore? Who owns the utilities? Who owns the data of the city? And who owns the banking? Who owns the power to generate finance? And these ownership designs sit very deep and are often deeply rooted in history, often in colonialism, but they profoundly shape everything else. And they shape the last one, which is, of course, finance. And how does the city finance itself? And what proportion comes from city taxes? And how are those taxes raised? And what comes from the public services the city delivers? And what comes from the city? Does the city have a bank, or does the city issue bonds? So, of course, the finance enables purpose. And so they're at the opposite ends of this signboard, but they're mediated through the networks, governance, and ownership in between. For me, this is really profound in Oxford, especially on the ownership and the ownership of our city, much by one university predominantly, and the impact that that has over hundreds of years. And how does that affect how we can make change, and who has voice, and how funding is raised? So let me finish. I believe it's time to absolutely leave behind the 20th century economics that I was taught and that we still hear sitting behind the evening news when we're told that GDP is going up or down, and that this apparently is the sign of the good or bad thing. We need to leave these behind because these old models weren't developed for us. The economists who drew them, I think, would say, what? Have you no ideas of your own? You're in a different century, a different era, a different understanding. Move on. We would have moved on. You guys move on. Let's come up with theories that fit our own times. So I start with an economics for 21st century cities and nations embedded in the living world. The goal is to get into the donut. We need to be regenerative and distributive by design, and we need to look at the design of our institutions, be they city councils, be they businesses, be they universities, because the design of how we design ourselves shapes who we can and cannot be in the world. Lastly, I've been working since mid last year to set up Donut Economics Action Lab. We're very proud to be part of the Make Space, which is based in Jericho, in a wonderful building, amazing community that I feel just embodies donut economics in its spirit and in its purposes. And our aim is to co-create resources and tools for uses by cities like the ones I've just shown, for community organizations, for teachers who want to teach this stuff anyway, even though it's not on the curriculum, for government, national or local, and for enterprise and business that says, well, we want to do business in this way. So if that sounds interesting and exciting to you from any of these dimensions, we're on Twitter at Donut Econ. We're going to be launching our website. Fingers crossed in the next couple of months. COVID's making it not easier, but we're going to be up online. We invite you to join our community platform and co-create tools and resources with us, because I really believe that 21st century economics will be practice first and theorized later. So let's get into practice.